Hi, this is Ralph Brandt from the Fireside. If you look over my shoulder, you'll see a kind of a cream-colored object. It's a 1940s era RCA radio. It has 5 tubes. That's those glass things that got hot. Up until the mid-1960s, that was what a radio had. That's what a TV had. Then along came those things called transistors. The first transistors came about in the late 1940s, I think around 1948. But until the middle or even late 1950s, they weren't used in much. It was just a brand new thing. Yes, the telephone and telecommunications industry was using them, but they were willing to pay high dollar numbers for them. The first transistor I worked with was a CK722. It was a germanium, not silicon. They were very delicate. You had to heat sink the leads if you soldered them. That meant you had to put a pair of pliers or a clip on them so that the heat didn't go inside and destroy the germanium. Today, the transistors are much more solid. That transistor cost me 99 cents. Which today would be about $9. Recently, I bought a pack of 2N2222 transistors. I believe there was 20 or 30 in it, not sure which, and I paid $5. It's changed a lot. I can buy components now for less than what I did then, dollar-wise, which the dollar is worth 1/10 of what it was at that time. Transistors that I was working with, the CK722s, were the cheapest transistors at the time. If you wanted an audio transistor that would drive a speaker, you were up in the $2, $2.50 range. By the time I graduated from high school in '61, there were some transistors out there that would do RF at higher frequencies. There were ones that would do RF into the broadcast band at that time, but not much higher than that. This is my background, and I'll talk more about that as I go on. But I'd like to talk right now about radio as it was in central Pennsylvania. And you have to remember that my early years were spent between Mount Holly and York Springs, near what's called Peter's Orchard Fruit Stand, if you know that one. I picked cherries and apples for them when I was younger. The radio stations that I was familiar with were WHP in Harrisburg, which is about the oldest. I believe it is the oldest in the area, somewhere in the 1925 era. WHYL in Carlisle was the ARC station. That was the one I tuned to get my snow reports off school. It at that time was not WHYL, it was WLXW. Somewhere in the early 1950s, the FCC stopped assigning call signs to radio stations and started allowing them to pick one. Now, it had to be acceptable. WLXW was the original call sign for Carlisle, which kind of is yuck. And they decided that they wanted WHYL. And for a long time, their theme was While in Carlisle. But WHYL was not the second. The second that I can find was WORK here in York, Pennsylvania. I believe it was 1250 at the time. And by the way, WHP was 580 and still is to this day. It's approaching its 100th anniversary. I'm pretty sure it's not there, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be in the next 3 or 4 years. I'm going to talk about it later. The second oldest was probably WSBA, or the third oldest rather, was probably WSBA, which I've seen 2 stories on it. One is that it was on 900, the other was that it was on 910. I found a newspaper article that shows 900, but I'm not so sure that that was not a mistake. WHYL in Carlisle has an interesting start date. I believe the year was 1948, and they came on the air on Saturday, interesting day to go on the air, somewhere around noon. It was the Saturday after Thanksgiving, and they did something that was very unusual at the time. They did a remote feed from downtown Carlisle into the station to cover Santa coming to town. At that time, the facilities to do those kind of things was very limited. I can't find any remotes much, at least in this local area, before that. Another station that was early on the air was WGET in Gettysburg, and it's got an interesting history too. It never was over 250 watts. Most of the stations were 1,000 or more, but it covered a pretty good-sized area, and there was an amateur radio operator, W3KGN, Walt Lane. That was Lane Studios at that time. Walt was a photographer who had a 275-watt amateur radio transmitter on the air at the same time. Interesting that this ham operator exceeded the local radio station in power. Our WGET did some interesting things too. The church that I was going to at the time had a program called the Young People's Church of the Air, and I'm going to say it was like 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. They had us record to hold in case we weren't there so that they had something to air. Radio stations do not like dead air time. That just causes real problems. In addition, during that time, we decided to hold a meeting in the Oddfellows Hall in Gettysburg. Now, the Oddfellows are somewhat, and I'll get in trouble for this statement, but they're somewhat similar to the Masons. If you see a lodge hall that has IOOF on it, that is the International Order of Oddfellows. It's a good group of guys, by the way. Know some about them, not a lot. By the way, there's still an Oddfellows Hall Lodge, I believe in Gettysburg, but I also know that there's one in East Berlin. Do not know if it's active, but there's one here in York, Pennsylvania, just off of Bannister Street. I believe the street name is Greenwood, that is active. And they do some interesting things. They do some tech things, people in the lodge. WGET did a remote pickup from the Oddfellows Hall. And I remember the guy coming in with a piece of equipment that kind of looked home built. And I built a considerable number of pieces of equipment myself, so I think I can judge that. They connected over a phone line with this piece of equipment back to the station. I bet there was one similar to it back there. And what I remember of it is it had 2 octal tubes sticking out of it. I'll talk about octal tubes and that in a later session. But it worked. And that was WGET. WHYL, a few years later, about 1948, a few years earlier, in 1948, did a remote pickup from the center of Carlisle. By the way, the old Carlisle radio station was on the property behind where Lowe's is today in Carlisle. They're on the south end of town. The station moved to another location and then lost that location. And if you go off the air, the FCC, after a period of time, will cancel your license. And it's very difficult to get it back. For a while, and I don't know if they still are, they were running a 47-watt or a 37-watt transmitter from somewhere else in the area, which was the only place that they could get and be within the requirements for the FCC to stay on the air. And they were just playing music, nothing much else. It's a shame because that's a long-term station, like 75 years, that might go away. Of those, WSBA is still a viable station. A little later, WHVR in Hanover came on. And WHVR was one of the early stations in the area to do FM. They were doing FM when FM was not covered much outside of very large cities, or at least medium-sized cities. WHVR was using FM. They were also on AM, but they had an FM transmitter. A little later than that, and I'm not sure of the time frame, a station came on the air here in York, WNOW. It was strictly country and western, and it premiered with FM. It was FM and AM. Listened to a lot of it. At that time, country music was good music. Today, some of it is suspect. That's kind of the radio stations that we had in the area. And some of them pioneered some things. Certainly, WHP in Harrisburg pioneered. I'll tell you an interesting story about WHP. Most people don't know this, but at one time, WHP coexisted on a frequency with a PSP, that's called Pennsylvania State Police. They were requiring WHP to go off the air in the evening, and I forget whether the time slot was 6 to 7 or 7 to 8. But they had to go off the air so that this PSP station could come on. Unfortunately, this PSP station was not just police stuff. It was becoming a government-run radio station. And of course, we do not have government-run radio stations today in the United States, but we have government-influenced radio stations, seriously influenced. And worse, government-influenced social media. But let's go back to WHP. WHP's primary person was a guy by the name of A.J. Stackpole, actually Colonel A.J. Stackpole. I have no idea what right he had to the title Colonel. It may have been something he tacked on himself. But the Stackpole family, which I believe even to this day owns media in Harrisburg, owned the station. And there's an article of it, if I can find, I will stick on this video. But he testified in front of the Federal Radio Commission. Now, most of you have never heard about it. If you change one word, you'll recognize it. It's called the Federal Communications Commission. That name change occurred sometime after that, and I'm not sure of when. But the Federal Radio Commission was being appealed to shut down or move the frequency of this PSP station. And A.J. Stackpole goes down to Washington and several times testified. And in one of those, I believe it's the Patriot, reports, Patriot News, Harrisburg. And they talk about his statement, and hopefully what is quoted is close to what he said. And he referred to this PSP station as a government-run station similar to the government-run stations of Europe. And I find this interesting because I'm kind of a student of history. And I want to look at what those government-run stations did. One of those government-run groups of stations put together a nationwide network in the early 1930s. And a charismatic, and the word charismatic does not necessarily mean good. It just means that people will flock to him. A charismatic leader in one of those European stations was able to take over the government, and in September of 1939 launched an attack on Poland that pretty well kicked off World War II. The man's name was Adolf Hitler. His ability to use the government-run stations that were then networked together so that he could speak to all of the German people at one time live helped propel him into that position and into that tight fist on that people. One of the lies that that we hear, and I'm going to digress to this. One of the lies that we hear is that the German officers really didn't support Hitler. They supported Germany, and because of Germany, they supported Hitler. This is debunked by many of their own writings. In fact, one of the generals was recalled, and he knew he was being recalled because Hitler had accused him of cowardice and being a turncoat. And he knew that if he was recalled, he was being recalled for a trial and probably an execution. He committed suicide rather than return to Germany from France. But one of the things that he did was wrote Hitler a letter. And that letter still pronounced his allegiance to Adolf Hitler. And we have several of those. That is a myth, that these officers were loyal to Germany, not to Hitler. In his letter, he did appeal to Hitler to end the war because of the loss of life. And that, to me, was commendable. But the letter ended with a statement of his loyalty to Adolf Hitler. And that just blows my mind in a way. But I saw the same thing with several other German officers. And certainly some of the ones who would have been in that boat might not have ever written anything like that, or it got lost. Now, I'll tell you another part of radio that existed in Germany or in Europe during World War II. It was a black radio group in Britain who was talking to the German people, but they were part of the intelligence in Britain, not BBC. And they would put out programs that looked loyal to Germany, but then twist some stuff to get people to do things that would be detrimental to the German war effort. And I may do another video directly on that. But one of the things that they did was they kept pounding this idea to the German officers that they were to be loyal to Germany, and that they were loyal to Germany, but not to Adolf Hitler. That myth that was created by the British exists to today. One of the things that concerns me today is the removal of AM radios from cars. I use it a lot. PennDOT has these signs around that tell you, tune to this frequency for local traffic information. And they'll have a flashing light above it saying, hey, we've got something special. Normally there's something there, but with the lights flashing, it's special. And I've avoided messes a few times. I have this thing, I do not like to participate in traffic jams or accidents. So if I can avoid something that's a traffic jam or something that's a potential accident, I'll go some other way. And that has served me well a few times. And people are wondering why. Because the extra cost for an AM/FM radio versus just an FM is totally insignificant. Even at the manufacturer's level, it's almost totally indescribably small. But there is a problem. EVs create horrendous amounts of radio frequency interference at low frequencies. That is between 500 kilohertz and 1600 kilohertz, which is the broadcast band. And rather than fight that problem and fix it, the EV industry is the one that has pushed taking the AM radio out of the cars. And by the way, if you're listening to all kinds of other stuff on the radio when you're on the road at drive time, if you're in this area around here, tune to WSBA or WHP. They do traffic reports regularly. I happen to know WSBA, which is my normal go-to in York. does traffic and weather on the 4s, it's called. And they, every 4 minutes, at 6:04, 6:14, 6:24, they do traffic and weather. And if I am on the road at that time, till I think it's 8 o'clock, they stop that, not sure. But if I'm on the road and here, I run that, and I listen for it. Because and by the way, it's Mark McKenzie, who is a really great guy, and I'll put in a plug here for him and Gary Sutton. It's an awesome team. The other morning, Mark did a solo because Gary was sick overnight and did a phenomenal job of it. Mark is a great guy. He also does a thing called Community Focus that's on, I think it's Saturday morning at 6 or Sunday morning at 6. Might be both. And he does in-depth stuff on local things like a food bank or anything like that. And he seems to scrounge up some of the most interesting and great groups in the area. Gary is a phenomenal knowledge base. By the way, Mark is too. I called him one morning and called Mark his sidekick and got slapped around the ears verbally for it, because he told me Mark is not his sidekick. He's his team member or teammate, and kind of gives you a picture of him. Good guy. But yeah, WHP has a similar traffic report. I don't go up into the Harrisburg area as often, so I don't keep track of exactly what their things are, but I know they do them. And I believe WHP does them in the evening. Don't think WSBA does. I don't usually am not listening to it at drive time. But checked out those resources. Many times they are better than the Waze reports. They're there 3, 4, 5 minutes before. Hey, that may be the difference between you going past the last exit you can get off and sitting in a traffic jam. But this is kind of the little bit of the history of radio in this area. We had some really neat disc jockeys back in the days. In the 50s, WORK was the 1250 station, which was older music. WSBA was the top 40 on Saturday afternoon, and I'm going to say, yeah, it would have been 1 to 5, 4 hours. They ran from the number 40 down to number 1. That type of music. Very good stuff. WNOW was country and western. You know, the old country and western. And by the way, there's still some good country and western, but some of it is pure crap. And I'm sorry if I say that, but I hope I don't offend anybody, but if I do, so be it. But that's what we saw in the 50s, and there were guys, in the 50s into 60s, there were guys like Ed Lincoln, Ralph Lockwood. Those two guys also did a lot of the DJs for dances. I'll finish this with one funny story. Those DJs were the salesmen for Ed's at that time. Lockwood, Ed Lincoln, and there's a couple of others. I'm not pulling names out right now. They would go out to businesses and, in fact, open the book and say, hey, buy some ads, buy some time. It's called keeping your job. Anyway, there was a business here in town, the Cadillac dealer, that refused to ever buy any time on WSBA. They advertised only on WORK. Their argument was, people who buy Cadillacs don't listen to WSBA music. And Ed Lincoln goes down one day, and he's been told that. And by the way, Ed and Ralph were both some really neat guys. And Ed says to the guy, he says, Hey, he says, randomly pick the keys for 6 cars that you've got on the lot that are used cars that come in for somebody trading on a new Cadillac. Okay. He says, I want you to get down and do something. And the guy, okay, humor the guy. He pulls 6 keys. They go down in the thing, and Ed says, start it up, turn the radio on. Ed hits the center button, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the old radios, they had 5 buttons. He would hit the center button, and WSBA would come up on all 6. They shut the cars off, went back up, and the next week, WSBA was playing Shaw Cadillac. They decided that just maybe prospective Cadillac owners listen to WSBA. Those are the kind of creative stories that I love to see, where somebody has turned a false narrative or false perception into something good. I love when I get a chance to do that, and I do once in a while. Going back to what I said earlier, we need to see that our media is not government controlled. This is Ralph Brandt from The Fireside.